He saw the love of his life heading to the scaffold, poised to die. He had survived rebellions, royal arrests, and the crushing weight of Tudor power. But nothing could have prepared him for this. His legs gave way. He collapsed right there. He had to be carried out. He was Henry Percy, one of the most powerful nobles in England, and the woman about to lose her head was Anne Boleyn, the woman he had secretly promised to marry years before King Henry VIII even noticed her. He had wept before Wolsey, arguing for her worth. He had fought with his father for her. And yet, if Anne was the one for him, why did he never marry her? If he truly loved her, how could he stand among those who sentenced her to die? And if their engagement was real, why did he deny it under oath, even as she walked toward the scaffold? Stay with me. This story will break your heart. The boy born with everything. When your father is called Henry the Magnificent, the pressure to be magnificent yourself is significant. Henry Percy was born around 1502, heir to the Percy family of Northumberland, one of the oldest, wealthiest, most formidable dynasties in all of Tudor England. The Percys had ruled the north for generations. Their name alone opened doors and silenced rooms. His mother was Catherine Spencer, daughter of Sir Robert Spencer, a noblewoman of good standing. His father, the 5th Earl, was a man of staggering wealth and old-fashioned grandeur. He ran his household like a small kingdom, meticulous accounts, precise rituals, a staff of hundreds. Everything about the Percy world said order, duty, legacy. And young Henry Percy was the centerpiece of that legacy, the eldest son. From the moment he could understand words, he understood this. He would inherit the earldom. He would carry the name. He would marry the right woman, chosen by the right people for the right political reasons. To prepare him for that destiny, his father sent him south, to London, to the household of the most powerful man in England outside of the king himself, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of York, the man who practically ran the country. Serving Wolsey was an education, not in books, but in power. You learned how decisions were made. You watched how a man with enough influence could bend even royal will. Percy was bright, Wolsey noticed. But Wolsey also noticed something else. The boy had a softness, an emotional openness that was inconvenient in a world like this one. His marriage had already been arranged. Mary Talbot, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, a solid political alliance, approved by both families. Percy hadn't been asked. Percy wasn't expected to ask questions. That was simply how things worked. And for a while, it seemed like young Henry Percy understood that perfectly. He did not. The woman no one expected. She didn't walk into the English court. She returned to it, and she was not the same person who had left. Anne Boleyn had spent her formative years at the French royal court. Let that sink in for a moment. The French court in the early 16th century was the most sophisticated, most politically charged, most culturally electric environment in Europe. It was a place where you had to think fast, speak well, and understand people before they understood you. Anne didn't just pass through that world, she learned from it. She came back to England around 1522. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious courtier. He had arranged a marriage for her. She was to wed her Irish cousin, James Butler, a match designed to resolve a long-running dispute over the Ormond inheritance between the Boleyn and Butler families. It was a cold, calculated arrangement. Anne had no particular say in it. The match eventually fell apart. The politics became too complicated to resolve. But that is why Anne came back when she did. She was placed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. It was a prestigious role, and in that role, Anne quietly, steadily became impossible to ignore. George Cavendish, and this name matters, so remember it, was Cardinal Wolsey's gentleman usher, his personal attendant, a man who stood in rooms where history was made and wrote down what he witnessed. His account of these events is the closest thing we have to an eyewitness record, not a rumor, not a later retelling, an account from a man who was there. Cavendish wrote that Anne outshone every other lady at court, that her comportment, her elegance, her way of carrying herself drew attention in a way that was almost involuntary. He wasn't flattering her, he was observing a fact. And Henry Percy was observing her. Whenever Cardinal Wolsey attended the royal court, Percy, as part of Wolsey's household, came along, and Percy had developed a habit of wandering to the Queen's chambers, of spending time with the ladies-in-waiting, of passing the hours in conversation. With Anne, the conversations grew longer, the visits more frequent. Cavendish recorded it without drama. Percy became most familiar with Anne above all the others. Something was growing between them, quietly, carefully. Neither of them was foolish enough to shout it, but courts are small places, and quiet things have a way of becoming very loud very fast. What happened next between them was not a flirtation. It was something far more serious and far more dangerous. The promise they shouldn't have made. In Tudor England, love was often complicated, and a single rumor could spark disaster. Here is something that most people gloss over when they tell this story. Percy and Anne did not simply exchange polite words or fleeting glances. They had made a promise to each other. Not a casual flirtation, not whispered words in the garden, but a vow, a personal, sacred promise that bound them in a way neither had fully understood. They did this without asking anyone. To Percy, it was more than duty, it was destiny. Anne was his, and he had meant to honor that, no matter the cost. Percy had thought it through, at least partially. Yes, Anne's father was a knight, not a nobleman, but Percy understood genealogy, and Anne's was formidable. Her mother carried Norfolk blood, one of the most noble lines in the country. Her father's line descended from the Earl of Ormond. She was not beneath him. Percy knew this. He believed it. He said it out loud when it mattered. But there was a danger Percy may not have fully realized. Henry VIII had noticed Anne Boleyn. Whether the king had clearly expressed his interest by 1523 is something historians still debate. But what is not debated is the nature of Wolsey's response when he found out. It was swift, it was aggressive, it was deliberately public, and it was the kind of response you only deliver when someone very important has told you to make a problem disappear immediately. A powerful northern heir marrying without royal consent was already an offense. But a powerful northern heir marrying a woman the king had already marked in his own mind, that was something the cardinal could not allow to stand. Percy and Anne had their promise. They had their plan. They believed, perhaps with the particular optimism of people who have never truly been denied anything that mattered to them, that love could simply outlast inconvenience. It could not. The cardinal was already reaching for them. The day Wolsey broke them apart. Wolsey didn't just end the engagement. He made sure everyone in the room watched it die. George Cavendish was standing in that room. He was Cardinal Wolsey's personal gentleman usher, his attendant, his shadow, and he wrote it all down. We are telling you what an eyewitness recorded in his own account of these events. The drama does not need embellishment. Wolsey summoned Percy, not privately, not quietly, but before the full household staff. Percy stood there in front of colleagues and servants while the most powerful churchman in England dismantled his future piece by piece. Wolsey was precise in his cruelty. He told Percy that the engagement was reckless. that Percy had failed to seek his father's blessing, that he had shown disrespect to his sovereign, that he had ignored the marriage already arranged for him, that he had presumed far above his place. And then, the line that must have landed like a stone, he told Percy that the king had already made other arrangements. The king would not be pleased. In Tudor England, that was not advice, it was a threat. Percy wept, in front of everyone. But he didn't collapse silently. He argued, he pushed back, he defended Anne's lineage with the precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed the argument in his own mind many times. He said he had gone so far in his commitment to Anne that he could not, in good conscience, simply undo it. Cavendish records this moment exactly as it was, a young man trying to hold something precious while the walls close in on every side. Then Percy's father arrived from the north. He had made the journey at the king's command, and he was not in a forgiving mood. He sat in the servants' hall, publicly, and called his son to stand before him, in front of everyone. What followed was not a conversation, it was a verdict. The elder Percy called his son proud, wasteful, and willful. He threatened disinheritance. He laid out clearly generations of Percy legacy, the family standing with the king, everything they had built, and he placed all of it on one side of the scale. On the other side, Anne Boleyn. Percy submitted. He agreed to honor the arrangement that had already been made for him, marry Talbot. Anne was sent away, back to her family's home at Hever Castle in Kent, furious, heartbroken, and quietly, carefully, cataloging exactly who had done this to her. But Cardinal Wolsey, who had stood in that room and treated the destruction of two people's future like a minor administrative task, had no idea what he had just set in motion. Two lives running in opposite directions. Percy married Mary Talbot because he was told to. What followed was 13 years of quiet, grinding misery. Mary Talbot was the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, a sound political match by every Tudor measure. On paper, the marriage made sense. In practice, it was a disaster almost from the beginning. The historian Josephine Wilkinson records that Mary Talbot often picked quarrels with Percy. She was combative, resentful, and deeply unhappy in the marriage. Percy was not an easy man to live with either, emotionally wounded, increasingly unwell, carrying the weight of a life that had gone precisely as others planned, and nothing like what he had wanted. They had a child, but the baby didn't survive. And in a marriage that had no warmth to soften grief, that loss didn't bring them closer. It just sat there, heavy, unspoken. There were no other children after that. The great Percy line, the legacy his father had raged at him to protect, was quietly dying with him. In 1527, Percy's father died. He became the 6th Earl of Northumberland. He served on the Council of the North. He enforced royal law. He suppressed uprisings in the turbulent borderlands. He was, by every official measure, a success. But 1532 had brought one more cruel twist. Mary Talbot made a dangerous public accusation. She wrote a letter to the Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's own uncle. She claimed that Percy's old betrothal to Anne had been a binding pre-contract. If true, it meant Percy's marriage was invalid. But more critically, it also meant Anne could never legally marry the king. Their union would be built on nothing. Their future children would have no legitimate claim to anything. Norfolk showed the letter to Anne, and Anne showed it to Henry VIII. Percy was investigated. He swore under solemn oath that he had never been pre-contracted to Anne Boleyn.
There was no binding agreement. It had never happened. And Anne swore the same thing, both of them, separately, under oath. Now here is the question that has never been cleanly answered, and the one that makes this story far more interesting than a simple love story. Were they both telling the truth, or had they agreed silently across the years and the distance and everything that had happened between them to protect each other one final time?
The rise of Anne Boleyn. The woman Percy gave up refused to be a minor character in anyone else's story. While Percy's marriage rotted quietly in the north, Anne Boleyn was rewriting the rules of what a woman could achieve in Tudor England. The woman Percy had given up was now the king's obsession. Henry VIII pursued her with a relentlessness that went beyond infatuation. He was obsessed, reshaping his entire emotional and political world around her. And Anne did something no one expected. She refused to be his mistress. She waited, she bargained, she stood her ground, and in doing so, she forced the most powerful king in Europe to face a truth he had never faced before, that he could not simply take what he wanted. What happened next shook all of England. Henry VIII wanted to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He asked the Pope for an annulment. The Pope refused. Henry, rather than accept that refusal, broke England from the Roman Church entirely and declared himself the supreme head of a new English church. He did all of this in significant part because Anne Boleyn would not settle for less than a crown. In 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England. There is no record of what Percy felt that day, none. But we know what happened 2 years earlier, in 1530. We know it because it is one of history's most quietly devastating ironies. Henry VIII had a particular talent for turning one person's loyalty into another person's destruction. In 1530, Cardinal Wolsey fell, the man who had stood in front of Percy and publicly dismantled his future, who had humiliated him in front of colleagues and servants and written the whole painful scene into the air of that room, had finally exhausted the king's patience. Henry VIII turned on him. Wolsey was charged with high treason. And the king chose Henry Percy to make the arrest. Think about the architecture of that decision for a moment. The king knew what Wolsey had done to Percy. Whether he understood the full depth of what had been taken, we can't be certain, but he knew enough to know that sending Percy was a message, perhaps to Wolsey, perhaps to Percy himself. Wolsey, by this point, was a broken man. He had lost his titles, his properties, his influence. He never faced trial. He died before he could reach London, worn down by the journey and by the collapse of everything he had built. Percy had his moment. What he felt in it, satisfaction, grief, nothing at all, history does not record. Anne was crowned queen. Wolsey was gone. But the cost of Anne's rise was still being calculated. And Percy was about to discover that the king had one more role for him to play, the cruelest one of all. The trial and the collapse. They made him sit in judgment of the woman he had once promised to marry, and they called that justice. By 1536, the political landscape had shifted again, and dramatically. Anne had not given the king the surviving son he had demanded. Her daughter, the future Elizabeth I, was brilliant and healthy, but Henry wanted a male heir, and he had grown impatient. Enemies had gathered around Anne. Charges were being assembled. Before the trial even began, the king tried one final time to use Percy's past against Anne. If the pre-contract could be proven real and binding, Anne's marriage to Henry would be legally void. Her daughter Elizabeth would be declared illegitimate. The whole problem of Anne Boleyn could be dissolved neatly on paper. Percy denied it again. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe there had never been a binding pre-contract, only deep love and promises made in youth. There was no document, no witness, nothing he could lay before the court. But what if there had been? What if he had stood up and claimed her? If he had sworn that she had once been promised to him, Anne's marriage to Henry VIII could have been declared invalid, an annulment, a separation, perhaps even exile, not the scaffold. Whether his denial was loyalty, fear, or the knowledge that the king had already chosen her fate, we cannot know. He held the line, but he could not hold the next line, the one that cost him everything that was left. Anne Boleyn's trial in May 1536 was, by most historical assessments today, a fabrication. The charges, adultery, conspiracy, treason, were built on evidence that was thin at best and manufactured at worst. Most historians now believe Anne was the victim of a deliberate political plot, engineered by her enemies at court, enabled by a king who had already decided he wanted her gone. Henry Percy was appointed as one of the noble peers, the jurors, at the trial. This was not optional. When the king appointed you, you served. And so Percy sat in that room, the man who had wept before Wolsey arguing for Anne's worth, the man who had made a formal betrothal to her in secret, believing it would hold, the man who had denied twice under oath the very existence of that betrothal, to protect her, or to protect himself, or both. That man now sat as one of the judges, deciding whether Anne Boleyn would live or die. The verdict was pronounced, guilty. The death sentence was announced, and Henry Percy, the 6th Earl of Northumberland, one of England's most powerful noblemen, collapsed. He didn't faint dramatically. He didn't stumble. His legs simply stopped working. He had to be carried out of the room. His body simply stopped cooperating with the role he had been given. Whatever composure, whatever distance, whatever armor of duty he had spent years constructing, it was gone in that moment. Anne Boleyn was executed on the 19th of May, 1536. She walked to the scaffold at the Tower of London with a composure that reportedly moved even her enemies. She was calm. She was dignified. She asked those present to pray for the king and for the realm. Percy was not there. He was already gone from the court. He was around 34 years old. She was 29. They had known each other for over a decade. They had been separated by power and forced into lives neither of them had chosen. And now it was over. But Percy, it turned out, didn't have much time left either.
8 months later. He outlived her by 8 months. And in those 8 months, everything he had left fell apart. Percy's health had been deteriorating for years before the trial, possibly liver disease. The historical record is not precise about the cause. What is clear is that after Anne's execution, whatever had been holding him together gave way rapidly. The political pressure did not ease. His brothers, Thomas and Ingram Percy, became entangled in the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive popular rebellion against Henry VIII's religious reforms. The fallout was brutal. Percy was not directly involved, but the shadow of treason touched his family, and the weight of it pressed down. He died on the 29th of June, 1537. He was approximately 35 years old. The marriage to Mary Talbot was, by this point, a legal arrangement in name only. They had long since stopped living as husband and wife. The child they had lost was never replaced. He died in debt, childless. The great Percy earldom, that ancient, magnificent inheritance his father had raged at him to protect, that his family had built across generations, passed eventually to the crown. Everything his ancestors had cultivated with such ferocious care, gone. He was buried at Hackney Parish Church.
He had the title. He had served every command placed before him. He obeyed his father, obeyed the cardinal, obeyed the king, even when obeying meant sitting in that room. He did not have Anne. He never did. And in the end, he didn't have much else either. There's something worth sitting with here. Henry Percy did everything the world demanded of him. He gave up the woman he loved. He married the woman chosen for him. He fulfilled every duty assigned to him by the people who claimed to know better. He obeyed, completely, consistently, at enormous personal cost, and it protected nothing. Not his marriage, not his family, not his legacy, not even his health. He was, as the historian puts it, a man who lived his life in the shadow of what if, caught between his heart and the absolute power of the Tudor crown. Now, here's the question that has lingered over this story for nearly 5 centuries, and it is one historians still argue about.
A lost love and a life that never fit. Henry Percy and Mary Talbot were never happy. Not because they were cruel people, but because neither of them had chosen the other. Mary was forced on him. His family made the decision, and he paid for it. Their marriage became a quiet battlefield. Arguments over money, over pride, over wounds that never healed. The historian Josephine Wilkinson notes that Mary often quarreled with Percy. It wasn't passion, it was resentment. And Percy carried something she could never compete with. He never forgot Anne. How could he? Anne wasn't a faded memory. She was Queen of England. Every time her name was spoken at court, it echoed back to him. Every letter, every rumor, every royal move. He had once promised to marry her. Instead, he watched her rise and fall. So here's the question that lingers. What if Percy had walked away from his inheritance? What if he had given up the earldom, left the court, and married Anne anyway? He was the heir to one of the greatest earldoms in England. His father was aging, his brothers were younger and less established. What if he had walked out of that room, kept his promise to Anne, and accepted whatever came next? Would they have lived a quiet life in the north? Safe? Unknown? Happy? And what if Henry VIII had never fallen in love with her at all? No crown, no break with Rome, no scaffold. Would Anne Boleyn have lived longer and better? Or was she always meant for the center of the storm? So I want to ask you something before you go, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. If Percy had married Anne, do you think she would have lived a happy life, away from the court, away from the crown, away from all of it? Or was Anne Boleyn the kind of person whose ambition and intelligence meant she could never have been truly satisfied outside of history's biggest stage? Did she need the crown to be herself, or did the crown cost her everything? Leave your answer below. There is no clean answer to this one, which is exactly why it is worth asking. If you found this story worth your time, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every like tells the algorithm that untold historical stories like this one are worth surfacing, and that means I can keep making them. Share it with someone who loves history, or someone who thinks they don't. Want another story from this world, where loyalty and survival were rarely the same thing? Check out the next video. I think you'll find it just as hard to put down. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you there.